So yeah, this might sound insane, but hear me out. I needed a job, like bad. My student loans were drowning me faster than I could doggy paddle, and the part-time online marketing assistant gigs I kept finding on LinkedIn, all scams. Seriously, how is that even legal? Anyway, I was desperate, like browsing Craigslist desperate, but even that didn't get me anywhere, unless you count a $20 offer to clean out a shed full of spiders. Hard pass. That's when I started hearing whispers about the other internet, the sketchy, you should probably have a VPN for this kind of internet, the dark web. A friend of a friend, or maybe a total weirdo I don't even remember, mentioned that it wasn't all criminal rings and hitmen for hire. Sometimes people posted job offers there, ones you wouldn't find anywhere else. Now, I'm not completely stupid. I wasn't about to sign up for something that screamed human trafficking. But curiosity got the better of me. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I downloaded Tor, clicked through some forums, and eventually stumbled upon a post titled "Hiring Staff for Small Diner, 9 to 5 shift. Immediate openings, housing included." I know, that's like the opening to every horror movie ever, but I swear to you, the post didn't seem that sketchy. The diner looked super retro in the pictures, like one of those places you'd see on an Instagram travel account. Neon sign, checkerboard floor, milkshakes in those tall glasses. You get the vibe. The job description? Basic stuff. Waiting tables, washing dishes, maybe some food prep. Nothing about your soul being required as payment or anything. It was posted by someone named Mitch, and he even included an email address that sounded halfway legit. The cherry on top? The diner was in a small town I'd never heard of, out in the desert somewhere between Nevada and Arizona. I emailed Mitch because, honestly, I thought, what's the worst that could happen? Sure, the pay wasn't great, minimum wage plus tips, but the fact they were throwing in free housing made it seem like a pretty solid deal. Plus, I could use the change of scenery. My sad apartment in the city wasn't doing much for my mental health. Within an hour, I got a reply. "You're hired. Start Monday. Address is attached. Drive safe. Mitch." That was it. No follow-up questions, no interview, not even a phone call. I should have been more alarmed by that, but I was so stoked that I didn't care. I packed up my beat-up Honda Civic, grabbed the essentials, and set out on what I figured was just going to be an interesting side quest in my otherwise boring life. The drive was weird. You know when you're on a road trip and you see fewer and fewer cars until it's just you and the horizon? Yeah, multiply that by 10. No gas stations, no billboards, no cell service, just endless desert and the occasional tumbleweed. Even Google Maps freaked out and kept rerouting me, but I eventually found the place, thanks to the vague instructions Mitch had included in his email. The diner was exactly like the photos. Neon sign buzzing softly, a parking lot with just a couple of cars, and that old-school aesthetic that felt like stepping back into the 60s. But here's where things started to get off. For one, the neon sign didn't say Mitch's Diner or Route 66 Eats like you'd expect. Instead, it just said EAT, nothing else. Just that one word, glowing faintly pink against the twilight. It gave me this weird sinking feeling, like when you realize you've walked into the wrong classroom, but you sit down anyway because it's too late to back out. I parked and went inside, and that's when things got really strange. The interior was spotless, like almost unnervingly so. No grease stains, no scuffed up tiles, no smell of burgers or fries. Just the faint scent of lemons. Mitch was standing behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag, and he looked exactly how I imagined he would. Mid-50s, balding, with a faded green apron. Totally normal. He smiled when he saw me and said, "Right on time. You must be my name." I nodded and tried to shake off the nerves. He handed me an apron, gave me a quick tour of the place, and said something about the night shift being their problem, which I didn't totally understand at the time. Then he pointed me to a little trailer behind the diner, my new home. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a bed, a mini fridge, and even Wi-Fi. I figured I'd hit the jackpot. The first couple of days were uneventful. The diner was slow, mostly serving truckers and the occasional lost tourist. I was getting used to the rhythm of things when, on my third night, Mitch handed me the keys and said he had to run into town for supplies. "Don't worry," he said, "you'll do fine on your own." I almost laughed. It was just a diner. What could go wrong? But the second he left, the entire vibe of the place shifted. The lights seemed dimmer, the hum of the neon sign outside was louder, and I swear the air got colder. Then the customers started coming in. So Mitch leaves, and I'm standing there, apron on, feeling like I've been thrown into the deep end. The diner had been empty all day, literally empty. I figured the dinner rush might bring a few people, but after the way Mitch just up and left, my confidence wasn't exactly skyrocketing. Still, I told myself it was just a diner. What's the worst that could happen? That's when the first customer walked in. He was tall, like really tall. I'm bad at guessing heights, but this guy had to be close to 7 feet. He was wearing this old-school trench coat, the kind you only ever see in detective movies, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. It felt out of place. I mean, we're in the middle of the desert. Why would anyone need that much clothing? Still, I plastered on my best customer service smile and said, "Welcome in. Sit anywhere you'd like." He didn't say anything. He just stood there for an uncomfortable amount of time, like he was sizing me up. Finally, he moved to a booth in the far corner and sat down, his back to the rest of the diner. I grabbed a menu and walked over, trying not to let my hands shake. When I handed it to him, his fingers brushed mine, and I swear to God they were ice cold. Not like AC on too high cold, more like I just stuck my hand in a snowbank cold. "Anything to drink?" I asked, my voice wobbling slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head just enough for me to see a sliver of his face under the hat. His skin was pale. Too pale, like someone had cranked the saturation down to 0. And his eyes? I swear they were completely black. No whites, no iris, just black, like 2 polished stones. "I'll take a coffee," he said finally. His voice was so low it felt like it vibrated in my chest. I nodded quickly, muttered something about it being right up, and practically sprinted back behind the counter. As I poured the coffee, I kept glancing at him, but he just sat there, completely still. No phone, no fidgeting, nothing. It was unnerving, but I chalked it up to him just being eccentric. Maybe a trucker with a weird fashion sense. I mean, people are strange, right? But then the second customer came in. This one was a woman, mid-30s maybe, wearing a bright red dress that looked way too expensive for a diner like this. She walked in like she was gliding, her heels not making a single sound on the tile floor. When she reached the counter, she smiled at me, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect. It was too wide, her teeth unnaturally white, like a toothpaste ad, but wrong. "Hi there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sit anywhere you'd like." She didn't move, just stared at me with that creepy smile and said, "I'll have a milkshake." Strawberry. Her voice was high-pitched, almost like a child's, and for some reason, it sent a chill down my spine. I nodded and went to make her milkshake, but when I turned back to tell her it'd be just a minute, she was already sitting down, in the booth, directly across from the trench coat guy. I didn't hear her move, not even a footstep. As I brought her the milkshake, I noticed something strange. She wasn't blinking, not once. I set the glass in front of her, and her smile widened even further, which I didn't think was possible. Then she started sipping through the straw, her eyes locked on mine the entire time. At this point, I was officially creeped out, but it got worse, much worse. Over the next hour, more people started trickling in. At first, I was relieved. A full diner meant less time to obsess over how weird those two were. But as the booths filled up, I realized something. None of them were normal. There was an old man with liver spots all over his face who shuffled in and ordered a glass of water. That's it. Water. He sat at the counter and just stared at the wall, not drinking, not moving, not even acknowledging me when I checked on him. Then there was a kid who couldn't have been older than 9. He sat in a booth by himself, swinging his legs back and forth under the table. When I went to take his order, he didn't look up from the Game Boy he was holding. Yeah, Game Boy, like, who still uses those? "Fries," he said flatly, his eyes glued to the screen. I brought them out, and when I came back to clear the plate, they were untouched. He was still playing that Game Boy, the exact same way as if he hadn't moved an inch. But the worst was the guy in the corner. He didn't come in through the front door like everyone else. 1 second the booth was empty, and the next, there he was. I didn't even see him sit down. He was hunched over, wearing a tattered hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. His hands, if you could even call them that, were long and spindly, the fingers almost claw-like as they drummed on the table. When I went over to him, he didn't say a word. He just slid a piece of paper across the table toward me. It wasn't an order. It was a photograph. I picked it up and froze. The picture was of me, standing behind the counter, wearing the exact same clothes I was wearing right then. Where did you get this?" I asked, trying not to let my voice crack. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head up just enough for me to catch a glimpse under the hood. His eyes weren't black like trenchcoat guys. They were pure white, glowing faintly like a pair of headlights in the fog. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the photo. I'll get Mitch," I stammered, backing toward the kitchen door. The moment I said Mitch's name, the entire diner went silent. I don't mean quiet, I mean dead silent. No hum of the neon lights, no clinking of forks on plates, nothing. All the customers turned to look at me at the same time, their heads moving in unison, their unblinking eyes boring into me. That's when I realized something I'd been trying to ignore all night. None of them had cast a shadow. I stood there, frozen, my back pressed against the swinging kitchen door. All eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were on me. Not a single person blinked or moved. It was like the entire diner had been paused, but I could feel them watching, waiting. I don't know what they were waiting for, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The picture was still clutched in my hand, crumpled now from how tightly I was gripping it. My face stared back at me from the photo, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background, right behind me, there was someone standing at the window. Their face was blurred, but it looked like they were inside the diner, right where I was standing now. I shoved the photo into my pocket and pushed through the kitchen door, needing to get away from those things. The kitchen was empty, of course. Mitch hadn't left any instructions, no notes about what to do if the customers turned into literal nightmares. There was just the hum of the fridge, the faint smell of burnt grease, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. I grabbed my phone and unlocked it, my fingers shaking so badly I almost dropped it. No bars, not even a single dot of service. I connected to the diner's Wi-Fi, thank God I'd remembered the password from earlier, but when I opened my messages they wouldn't send. I tried calling Mitch, but all I got was static, not even a voicemail, just static. That's when I heard it. A faint, scraping sound like metal on tile. It was coming from the dining area just beyond the door. I peeked through the small, round window and my stomach dropped. The man in the trench coat was standing now, towering over his booth. His hat was gone, and his head wasn't right. His skin looked stretched, too tight over his skull, and there was a deep crack running down the center of his forehead, splitting it like dry earth. His jaw hung slack, too wide, like someone had unhinged it. And his eyes, those black, soulless eyes, were fixed directly on the kitchen door. The scraping sound grew louder, and I realized it was his nails dragging across the counter as he moved, slowly, toward the kitchen. I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of utensils, the clang of metal echoing through the empty room. The noise must have startled him, because he stopped. But then the others started moving too. The woman in the red dress stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The old man at the counter twisted his head toward the kitchen, his neck cracking with the motion. Even the kid with the Game Boy put his console down, his head tilting at an unnatural angle as he stared at the door. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. And then, without warning, the kitchen lights went out. Complete darkness. I scrambled for my phone, the faint glow of the screen the only thing keeping me from losing my mind completely. I turned on the flashlight and shone it around the kitchen, trying to find anything that could be used as a weapon. My hand landed on a cast-iron skillet, and I clutched it tightly, my knuckles white. The kitchen door creaked. Slowly I turned toward it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was swinging open just enough for me to see into the dining area. The trenchcoat man was there, his face pressed against the glass of the window, his breath fogging it up. Except he wasn't breathing. The fog wasn't coming from him. It was coming from me. My breath was fogging up the glass, even though I was several feet away. And then I realized why. He wasn't outside the door. He was inside the kitchen. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room, and there he was, standing in the corner, his head tilted to one side, his jaw hanging open, his mouth stretched wider and wider, and I swear I could hear the skin tearing as it did. It wasn't a scream exactly, it was more like a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the air and making my teeth ache. I swung the skillet without thinking, the heavy metal connecting with his head with a sickening crack. He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his long, claw-like fingers reaching for me. I swung again, harder this time, and he stumbled back, his head snapping to one side like a broken doll. But he didn't fall, he just stood there, tilting his head slowly back to center, and I realized I wasn't going to win this fight. I bolted, I shoved past him, barreling through the kitchen door and back into the dining area. The customers were all standing now, their faces twisted and wrong. The woman in the red dress was grinning so wide her cheeks had split, black ooze dripping down her chin. The old man's jaw was hanging at an impossible angle, and the kid with the Game Boy. His eyes were gone, just two empty sockets staring at me as he reached out with tiny, skeletal hands. I didn't wait to see what they were planning to do. I ran for the front door, but when I reached it, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't open. It was like it had been welded shut. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the glass. But outside, the parking lot was empty. My car was gone. Even the neon sign had gone dark. Then I remembered the back door, the one that led to the trailer. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, the sound of scraping footsteps growing louder behind me. When I reached the door, I yanked it open and stumbled outside, slamming it shut behind me. The desert air was cold, biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I ran to the trailer and locked myself inside, collapsing onto the bed in a shaking, gasping heap. For a moment, everything was silent. No footsteps, no voices, no nothing. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd gotten away. But then I heard it. A single knock on the trailer door, and a voice, low and gravelly, whispering, "You forgot your photo." The knock echoed through the tiny trailer like it was coming from inside my head. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought my heart had completely stopped. The voice outside was barely above a whisper, but it carried so much weight that it felt like the air in the room had been sucked out. "You forgot your photo," it repeated, slower this time, like it was savoring each word. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My body felt like it was made of cement, frozen in place on the bed. My brain screamed at me to do something, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the door. The flimsy lock on the trailer suddenly felt useless, like it was made out of cardboard. Another knock. Louder this time. And then the doorknob started to turn. I launched myself off the bed and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a cheap desk lamp. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The door rattled as whoever or whatever was outside pushed harder. The entire trailer shook with the effort, the sound of metal groaning under the strain. I backed into the corner, clutching the lamp like a lifeline, and prayed to a God I wasn't even sure I believed in anymore. And then it stopped. The rattling, the knocking, even the whispering, all of it just stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise, like the world was holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like hours, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open, but it didn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually my muscles started to ache, and the adrenaline faded just enough for me to think semi-clearly. I crept toward the door, one shaky step at a time, and pressed my ear against it. Nothing, just the sound of the wind outside, whistling through the desert. I should have felt relief. I should have been glad that whatever was out there was gone. But I wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse. I peeked out the window, careful not to let the curtain move too much. The parking lot was completely empty. No cars, no people, no sign of life at all. Even the diner looked different. The neon sign was off and the windows were pitch black, like the building itself had been abandoned for decades. I could have sworn the parking lot was covered in sand too, like it had been reclaimed by the desert overnight. I turned back to the door, trying to decide if it was worth the risk to step outside. That's when I noticed the photo. It was on the floor, right in front of the door, like someone had slid it under. My stomach twisted into knots as I bent down to pick it up. It was the same picture as before, me standing behind the counter at the diner. But this time, there was something new in the frame. In the photo, the dining area behind me wasn't empty anymore. The booths were full of shadowy figures, their faces blurred beyond recognition. And standing directly behind me was the trenchcoat man, his black eyes locked onto the back of my head. I dropped the photo like it was on fire, my hands trembling so badly that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about this made sense. Nothing about this was normal. I knew I couldn't stay in the trailer. Whatever was going on, I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and keys, shoved on my sneakers, and bolted for the door. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and dry, but I didn't stop to take it in. I sprinted toward the parking lot, praying that somehow my car had reappeared. It hadn't. The lot was still empty, the ground covered in sand that crunched under my feet. My lungs were burning, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop. If I couldn't drive out of here, I'd run. I didn't care how far it was to the next town, I just had to get away. But as I reached the edge of the parking lot, I stopped dead in my tracks. The road was gone. I don't mean it was covered in sand or blocked by something. I mean it was gone. The diner and the trailer were surrounded by endless desert, stretching out in every direction. No highway, no signs, no landmarks, just an infinite expanse of dry, cracked earth and jagged rocks. Even the sky didn't look right. The stars were too bright, too close, like they were pressing down on me. And then I heard it again, the voice. "You can't leave." It was coming from behind me, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep underground. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. Just the diner, its windows now glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. I backed away, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone. The light inside the diner flickered, and for a moment I saw them, the customers. They were all standing by the windows, staring out at me. Their faces were twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And standing in the center of them was the trenchcoat man, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, his black eyes locked on mine. "You belong here now," the voice said, louder this time. And then the door to the diner swung open. The customers stepped out, one by one, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. The trenchcoat man followed last, his long fingers dragging along the side of the building as he walked. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, and it sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock and landing hard on the ground. The sand was cold against my skin, almost like it was alive, writhing beneath me. I scrambled to my feet and turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The desert stretched out endlessly, and no matter which direction I looked, it all felt the same. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The diner's neon sign flickered back to life, casting an eerie pink glow over the parking lot. But it didn't say eat anymore. It said stay. I stood there, staring at the neon sign, the word stay pulsing faintly in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought they might give out, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The customers, the things, were standing just outside the diner, their distorted faces illuminated by the sickly pink light. They weren't moving, but somehow I knew they were waiting for me to do something. And then, like a switch had been flipped, they started walking toward me. Not running, walking, slowly, methodically. But their movements were wrong, too stiff, too jerky. The woman in the red dress had her head tilted back so far I thought her neck might snap. The old man's limbs seemed to bend in directions they shouldn't. And the kid with the empty eye sockets? He held his hands out in front of him, like he was reaching for me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and landed hard on the sand. My flashlight rolled out of my hand, the beams slicing through the dark. That's when I saw them. Shadows. Not theirs. Mine. My shadow stretched out across the sand in front of me, but it wasn't alone. There were dozens of shadows all around me, circling, twisting, moving closer. But when I looked up, there was no one there. Just the desert. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and pointing it wildly in every direction. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Just stay the hell away from me!" The shadows didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to close in faster, the air around me growing colder with every passing second. My breath came out in short, frantic gasps, visible in the freezing night air. It felt like the desert itself was alive, suffocating me, crushing me under its weight. And then I heard it again, the voice. "You belong here." This time it wasn't coming from behind me. It wasn't coming from the diner or the trenchcoat man or any of the other nightmare customers. It was coming from inside my head. The words echoed in my mind, bouncing around like they were trying to carve their way in. I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut, but it didn't help. "Stop it!" I screamed. "Leave me alone!" When I opened my eyes, the customers were closer. Too close. The woman in the red dress was only a few feet away, her head tilted unnaturally as she smiled down at me. Her teeth were too white, too sharp, glinting in the dim light. The old man stood beside her, his jaw hanging open, his hollow eyes fixed on mine. And the kid, he was clutching that Game Boy in one hand, the other reaching out to grab my arm. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam bouncing across their faces. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm warning you!" The trenchcoat man stepped forward, towering over all of them, his head tilted, his black eyes staring straight into mine. "You can't leave," he said, his voice so low it felt like it was vibrating through my bones. I backed away, tears streaming down my face. My chest felt tight like I couldn't get enough air. "Why?" I choked out. "Why me?" "You answered," the trenchcoat man said simply, his cracked lips curling into a grotesque smile. "You came here. You stayed. Now you're one of us." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not true. I'm leaving. I'm leaving right now." I turned and bolted into the desert, my sneakers kicking up clouds of sand as I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The flashlight beam bounced erratically in front of me, illuminating the endless stretch of desert. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't getting anywhere. And then I saw it. The diner. It was ahead of me now, the neon sign glowing faintly in the dark. "Stay." I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, looking back the way I came, but the desert stretched out endlessly in every direction. There was no road, no landmarks, no sign of escape. Just the diner, standing there like it had been waiting for me all along. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." I turned and ran in the opposite direction, pushing myself harder than I ever thought I could. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. But after what felt like miles, I saw it again. The diner. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I collapsed to my knees, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away. The light flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The only light came from the diner's neon sign, casting an eerie pink glow over the sand. I was crying now, full-on sobbing, but I didn't care. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The shadows moved closer, and I could feel them now, cold and heavy, pressing down on me. The voice in my head whispered again, soft and insistent. "Stay." The diner door swung open, and the light inside spilled out, warm and inviting. For a moment, I thought I saw something familiar. My car was parked out front, and the diner looked normal again. Clean, bright, like it had been the first time I walked in. And then I saw myself. I was standing behind the counter, wearing the same uniform, the same apron, smiling at the customers as they ate. It wasn't just a reflection, it was me. But it wasn't. My smile was too wide, too fake. My eyes were empty, hollow. I shook my head, backing away from the vision, but the shadows closed in, forcing me closer to the diner. The trenchcoat man stepped forward, his long fingers reaching out to me. "You belong here now," he said again, his voice a low growl. The last thing I remember was the neon sign flickering again, the letters rearranging themselves one final time. "Welcome home." I woke up behind the counter, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. The diner was clean and bright, the sun shining through the windows. Mitch was standing by the grill flipping pancakes, and he grinned when he saw me. "Right on time," he said. "You ready for your shift?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 9 a.m. My shift had just started, and the first customer of the day was already walking in.